Yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin dropped something of a bombshell when, at the conclusion of a very lengthy meeting with civilian officials discussing the organization of the civilian needs of the civilian population in the Russian border regions of Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod, he suddenly let slip the fact that the night before there had been a Ukrainian attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant. He provided no details, just mentioned the fact that the attack had taken place, as if he was expressing an afterthought, though he did say that the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mr. Grossi, has been urgently contacted and invited to visit the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, over the course of the following hours, there were a number of reports about what happened on the official Russian news agency TASS, and they say that over the course of that night, the Ukrainians attacked the Kursk nuclear power plant with a suicide drone, only it was detected and shot down some distance from the plant. This is the first direct attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant since Ukraine began its operation in Kursk on the 6th of August. Now, over the last couple of days, Ukraine has been resuming its massive drone offensive right across Russia. There's been attempts to attack Russian military airfields, and there was also an attack with 42 drones on Moscow. None of these attacks appears to have done any significant damage. The most spectacular damage that I've seen up to now was a missile attack using apparently a Neptune anti-ship missile against a Russian ferry in Taman, the area of Taman, in Russia, a coastal area of Taman. This missile hit a ferry. The ferry was destroyed, and about a dozen people were killed, and there is a very spectacular fire. There are questions, by the way, about how this particular missile reached that territory. You look at where the Taman Peninsula is located and the port of Kafkas. I would have said that it is well outside the range of a missile, an anti-ship missile launched from land in Odessa. Presumably, the attack was carried out by an aircraft launching the missile from some airbase. But I'm not going to devote time and energy trying to analyze this particular attack. All I will say is the pictures of it were pretty spectacular. I suspect that all of these other attacks were intended to some extent to distract attention from the main attack, or rather from the one particular attack, which is intended to be on the Kursk nuclear power plant. Anyway, if one disregards the attack on the ferry, it does seem as if all of the other attacks, including the attack on Moscow, were unsuccessful. I've not seen any real evidence of any major damage done to any Russian facility as a result of Ukraine's last big drone attack. Indeed, I get the impression that the defenses, the air defenses of Moscow in particular, have been significantly strengthened, and perhaps the Russians have improved their ability to track and spot drones, and one way or the other, they seem to have succeeded in countering all of these drones and intercepting them before any damage was done. And that included the drone that sought to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant. There are lots of questions as to how exactly this has been done, but that, at least for the moment, seems to be the reality. Anyway, that brings us, however, back to this attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant. What this attack demonstrates is that the Kursk nuclear power plant is indeed a target, and that the Ukrainians are indeed attempting to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant. The fact that they haven't been able to reach it and seize it, which the Russians say, and which I believe was the initial objective, in fact the primary objective of the incursion into Kursk region, has now apparently been accepted in Ukraine. So attempts are now being made to do the same thing that the Ukrainians have been regularly trying to do with the power station in Zaporozhye, which is to launch drone attacks upon it. Mr. Grossi of the IAEA has also said that the forward positions of the Ukrainian forces are within artillery range of the Kursk nuclear power plant. But I'm going to speculate that launching artillery strikes on the Kursk nuclear power plant from these positions is going to be difficult for Ukraine, because though it's probably true that there are Ukrainian troops within notional artillery range of the Kursk nuclear power plant, deploying heavy artillery pieces in this area would be extremely difficult and would probably be detected by the Russians very quickly. So anyway, there we are, an attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant, all accompanied by these major drone attacks and this missile strike on the ferry in the Taman Peninsula. All probably indicating that Ukraine also needs to change the narrative and needs to change it in a hurry, because the military situation on the ground is bad in Kursk and it is becoming catastrophic everywhere else. And I don't think that anybody who follows the situation on the ground any longer would seriously dispute that description. Now, before I leave the topic of the attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant, let me just say that there is, of course, inevitably going to be an alternative version of events which are going to circulate. This is that there was no attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant at all, that the Russians are inventing one or imagining one, that they're doing that because they're frustrated at the lack of interest that people in the West have shown on the topic of the Kursk nuclear power plant, and that as a result, this is a story that the Russians have put out simply to draw attention to the Kursk nuclear power plant and to persuade everybody that it was indeed a Ukrainian target. Now, I don't personally believe that story, but I'm going to say this: it's difficult, it's impossible to refute it, and it might just possibly even conceivably be true. I think when the Russians say that there's been an attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant, I tend to believe them. After all, there's been corroboration in the Western media that attacks by Ukraine on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant have actually happened, and it would be consistent with Ukrainian behavior for there to have been an attack on the Kursk nuclear power station. So I tend to believe the Russian account of things, but of course I don't know myself exactly what took place that night. Maybe the Ukrainian version of events, which by the way has not yet circulated, but which as night follows day, I predict it will. Anyway, maybe such a Ukrainian claim will turn out to be true. I want to make it clear, I don't think so. But anyway, let's wait and see. Let's now talk about the situation on the front lines. But before we do, let's come back briefly to the situation, or rather the general situation in the Kursk area of the battlefronts, before I get into the weeds about what is going on in all sorts of other places. And let me start first of all by saying that it seems that the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, is now apparently intending to have a discussion with the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov. And we are being told that Lloyd Austin is now trying to find out what exactly the Ukrainian objective in Kursk at this time actually is. Now, of course, all of that assumes that the United States is completely innocent of any involvement in the operation in Kursk, and that Lloyd Austin just doesn't really know what the Ukrainians were ever up to, and is phoning up Umerov to find out what it was that the Ukrainians were thinking when they conducted this operation in Kursk region. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that they don't believe that. They believe that the United States was heavily involved in preparing and planning the Kursk operation. But there might nonetheless still be some truth in what these reports from the United States about the situation in Kursk region are saying. Because Ukraine has failed to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. It has not managed to capture Kurchatov, the town close to which it is located. It is bogged down in various battles around the same cluster of villages close to the border, as we will see shortly. It is suffering extremely heavy losses in terms of men and machines in precisely this area, as we are also going to see. It is begging the United States for resupply, and in fact we've had reports that the United States is indeed planning to send a further $125 million of military equipment to Ukraine, and I noticed that this is apparently going to include replacements or at least ammunition for HIMARS systems, which suggests that the Ukrainians are overusing HIMARS missiles. And Group of Forces North told us yesterday that most of the HIMARS systems now are located in and around Kursk. So there's been a very heavy investment of Ukrainian equipment and manpower around Kursk, and it's perhaps understandable that Lloyd Austin now wants to find out what it is exactly that the Ukrainians are trying to do with it. Now, yesterday, I quoted a piece by Group of Forces North, which they published on their website, Severny Vyeter, website, Telegram channel, in which they said that Ukraine has concentrated all its reserves and a third of its combat ready battalions in the Kursk and Sumy regions. And by the way, that report from Group of Forces North provoked all kinds of alarm on various parts of the internet, at least on the Russian side of the internet, suggesting that this means that there has been an enormous build-up of Ukrainian forces in this area, and that this opens the way for a Ukrainian offensive to try to capture Kursk city itself, and perhaps ultimately Belgorod, and who knows, Bryansk too, possibly, all of these places. Now, it's important to say that though Group of Forces North said that a third of Ukraine's combat battalions are located in this area, they didn't actually give a number, and they didn't tell us what the total number of Ukrainian combat battalions actually is, and nor did they give a number, a figure for the total size of the Ukrainian grouping. Ukrainian figures, by the way, now put the total size of the contingent, the forces that make up Group of Forces North, at around 72,000. So this is an increase from the 50,000 that was being floated at the time of the Kharkiv, the start of the Kharkiv operation by the Russians in May. So how many troops does Ukraine actually have in this area? Well, I don't know, but I don't think it is anything like as many as some people, based on this this one report from Group of Forces North, assume. I think that the fact that Ukraine has deployed a third, now accept what Group of Forces North say about this, a third of its combat battalions to the Sumy and Kursk region, is probably a reflection not so much on the scale of the Ukrainian build-up, but on two other things. The first is the shortage of fully combat-ready battalions in the Ukrainian military at this point in the war. As we will see, there are problems with manpower right across the battle lines. And secondly, the enormous cost of holding on to positions in this area, in the area of Kursk, the immense difficulty that the Ukrainians are themselves running into in holding their positions in Kursk region, let alone advancing beyond them. And in fact, I saw a report, I think it was on Slavyangrad, or it might have been Intel Slava or some other pro-Russian Telegram channel, but it appeared to be based on a Western source, which I was never able to identify. But anyway, what this report said was, and I found it plausible, was that the difficult logistics of this area, the shortage of good roads and railways, the forests, the heavy forests, and of course the strong forces that the Russians have in this area, is obliging the Ukrainians to keep a disproportionate number of troops deployed specifically in Sumy region in order to support their operations in Kursk region. And that the cost of these operations in Kursk region is leaving the Ukrainians with no real alternative but to do that. Moreover, this article, and as I said, I'm afraid I've mislocated it. Anyway, this article went on further to say that because of the difficulty of the geography and obviously the Russian resistance, it is proving very difficult for the Ukrainians to build up a critical mass of forces on the what you might call the front lines in Kursk region itself in order to advance further. So that probably explains the scale of the commitment of Ukrainian forces in this area of the battlefronts. And there does seem to be some genuine concern about the whole situation on the part of the Pentagon. On the 21st of August, NBC published an article saying that the risks of Ukraine's bold attack on Russia, its title is The Risks of Ukraine's Bold Attack on Russia. The surprise incursion has captured roughly 480 square miles of territory inside Russia, but US officials are concerned that Kiev's forces could be stretched too thin. And the article admits that the Russians have not transferred troops from Donbass. There's a quote, US officials are confirming as much, according to the article. And it says that the Russians have made no attempt so far to recapture the territory that the Ukrainians are occupying in Kursk region. We will discuss why that might be so. But then the article contains comments like this. US officials, and notice that these are officials, these are not just bloggers or ex-military people. Anyway, US officials and military analysts warn that there is a risk that Ukraine's supply lines could be overextended as it tries to sustain troops fighting inside Russia, as well as fend off Russian attacks across eastern Ukraine. It's a concern, said one US official. And then we're told that US officials say the precise objectives of the Ukrainian offensive inside Russia remain unclear, including whether Kiev intends to hold onto captured territory indefinitely to use as a bargaining chip in potential peace negotiations, or pull back into Ukraine. Notice that they're floating the possibility of a pullback of these forces back to Ukraine. And then we have a comment from Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Patrick Ryder, who is, by the way, in my opinion, a much more important source for military thinking within the Pentagon than the other spokesman, Sabrina Singh, who tends to get quoted quite a lot. Anyway, Ryder told reporters on Tuesday that the Ukrainians clearly have compelled the Russians to struggle in their response. It has certainly demonstrated the creativity and the battlefield prowess of the Ukrainians. Some might find those rather double-edged comments. The expression "damn with faint praise" comes to mind. But then comes the but. But when it comes to what their long-term objectives are, that's something that we're still discussing with them. And then we're told that Defense Secretary Austin spoke with Umerov on Monday, and apparently he's due to speak to Umerov again, about battlefield dynamics, Ukraine's ongoing operations, and Ukrainian reconstitution and training efforts. And then, again, that doesn't seem to me like a massive vote of confidence, those words, in the Kursk operation. And then we have an interesting quote from Matthew Saville, Director of Military Sciences at Britain's Royal United Services Institute, who said that if Ukraine tries to retain control of the captured area inside Russia, its troops would soon be vulnerable to heavy Russian air and ground attacks. The challenge is that it looks like the Ukrainians might be about to consolidate and dig in. Once they do that, this is all from Saville, once they do that and their rate of advance has slowed, which, by the way, is already the case, as we will see, they will become a target. And so the question for them is, how long are they planning to endure? If Ukraine tries to hold on to territory around Kursk for several months, that is going to be tough just to logistically supply that in the face of Russian air attack. And he then says that there's a possibility that the Russians might start to divert forces, especially from Kharkiv region, to hold the Ukrainians back. Again, to repeat, there's no great evidence of this so far. Then he goes on to say that they have shown what they that they can go on the attack, they can pose a threat. They've probably changed calculations in Moscow about the extent to which it needs to defend more effectively along the whole line. But is the last even really true? And isn't the situation that Savile himself is describing one which, given that this is an attrition war, the Russians might consider advantageous in some respects to themselves? Now note that all of this is coming from NBC, and it does seem to me as if the Pentagon at least is beginning to become increasingly queasy about this whole operation. Apparently Umerov and Austin had their conversation on Monday. As I said, I've seen reports which suggest that they're intending to have a further conversation, probably because of the Monday conversation. The Americans have chipped in with more weapons, but the Americans do seem to have growing doubts and are asking questions. And they are not that different from the questions I was asking at the conclusion of my program yesterday. If the Ukrainians cannot capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, given the scale of the losses they are suffering in the Kursk operation, given the disproportionate commitment of troops that they are making simply to maintain their position in Kursk, which is bleeding them dry everywhere else on the front lines, making it possible for the Russians to seize the opportunities to engage in further advances. Why are the Ukrainians persisting with this operation? Why, in fact, far from abandoning it, are they doubling down with it? Well, yesterday in my program, I suggested one explanation, which I suspect is the main one, or at least the one that is at the forefront of the minds of the various Kiev officials, Zelensky, Podolyak, Yermak, perhaps Syrskyi himself, Budanov, who masterminded this operation, no doubt with assistance from their friends in Washington and London and Brussels. And anyway, the overt explanation why they can't pull back is one of prestige. The article in NBC suggests that some officials in the United States probably do want to see a pullback. Notice again the loaded question in this paragraph in the NBC article. US officials say the precise objectives remain unclear, including whether Kiev intends to hold on to captured territory indefinitely or pull back into Ukraine. So some officials, that's how I read that paragraph, would rather see Ukraine pull back. It makes no military sense for the Ukrainians to stay there. But of course, for Zelensky and for the people around him, pulling back from Kursk after the enormous investment they've made in it would be politically catastrophic. I have to say, I doubt that Zelensky himself, especially after the huge losses the Ukrainians have been suffering over the course of this operation, I doubt that Zelensky himself would survive a retreat from Kursk now, especially if it was ordered before a counterattack from the Russians took place. Now, yesterday, I also floated the possibility mentioned to me by one of the members of the community in an email that maybe this is a complicated way of redeploying forces from the Donbass and withdrawing from the Donbass without announcing it. This is in effect what the Ukrainians are doing. As I said, I could see the logic of that, but I can't imagine that Zelensky and Syrskyi and all of those people would seriously be thinking of doing something like this. Over the course of the last couple of hours, I've been giving further thought to this, and I wonder whether perhaps, at some level, perhaps even unacknowledged, there is another reason for this insistence on maintaining the positions in Kursk, and indeed for the launching the operation in Kursk in the first place, thereby perhaps preempting a Russian offensive in the autumn towards Sumy region. And that is Zelensky's fear of a further Russian advance, another Russian advance towards Kiev itself. Weeks ago, back in May, when the Russians began the Kharkiv operation, there were reports that Zelensky was in a state of panic and fury about it. There were reports in the Western media that he was screaming at his generals, trying to find out what was going on, and convinced that they were lying to him about the Kharkiv operation. He insisted on deploying huge numbers of troops to try to hold back the Russian advance in Kharkiv. He apparently also insisted on counterattacks in Kharkiv region in order to try to push the Russians back out of Kharkiv region, back into Belgorod region. These counterattacks amounted to a series of attacks on the Russian positions in the village of Gluboka, near Lipsy. The attacks were ultimately unsuccessful, resulting only in heavy Ukrainian losses. It seems that somewhere along the way, the forces that had been assembled for the Kharkiv counterattack were transferred to Sumy and launched with a view to conducting the offensive in Kursk. The key thing, however, is, again, Zelensky's extreme response to the Russian incursion in Kharkiv region, and the extent to which he insisted on transferring large numbers of troops from all across the front lines to try to stem the Russian advance in Kharkiv region. And, well, the obvious explanation was that he was afraid that the Russians would capture Kharkiv region, would capture the city of Kharkiv itself, Ukraine's second biggest, and also in Sumy region, as he undoubtedly remembers, in February, March 2022, Sumy region provided the main invasion route for the Russian army moving towards Kiev. The Russians quickly occupied the town of Sumy itself. They seized control of the main road, and their forces moved along the road to Kiev itself. And though there was a parallel Russian advance from the north, it was this advance along the road from Sumy that perhaps put the greatest pressure on the Ukrainians of all. This in the first few weeks of the special military operation in February and March 2022. And of course, Zelensky will also remember the extreme stress that he was under over the course of those days. The Russians were just a few hundred meters from his office. I remember that there was an extremely fraught press conference in which Zelensky addressed the Western media. Apparently, he looked exhausted and haggard and incredibly stressed, and there were lots of reports about him having fled Kiev to go to Lvov. Turned out that those reports were untrue, but there was no doubt at all that for several weeks in February and early March, Zelensky found himself under extreme stress. And one can perhaps understand why, having lived through that experience once, he doesn't want to repeat it again. And the fact that the Russians are back in Kharkiv region, and that there were reports a few weeks ago that they were building up their forces in Sumy region, and all the talk about a Russian offensive through Sumy region, potentially towards Kiev itself, one can perhaps understand why he and his team, and perhaps their Western advisors, began to become nervous, and as nervous people sometimes do, they came up with this extraordinary plan to preempt the Russian offensive, launch an offensive of their own into Kursk region and seize the nuclear power station in order to put themselves in a position where they could perhaps claim that they'd reverse the tables on the Russians. And I think that might be the true explanation. Obviously, I can't say that for certain. I can't read Zelensky's mind. He's obviously not going to share his thoughts with me. But it seems to me the best explanation for the very strange behaviour we've seen from the Ukrainians up to now, which clearly has the Pentagon itself worried. I sense that the Pentagon wants to see this operation in Kursk wound up as soon as possible. They're worried about the losses that the Ukrainians are suffering. They're worried about the fact that a disproportionate number of Ukrainian troops are tied up in this area. And they're worried also about the ongoing collapse in Donbass. But if the motivations for this operation were, as I have said, a combination of saving face, of gambling to gain control of the nuclear power station in order to put themselves in a better position in new negotiations maybe with the Russians, and above all fear that the events of February, March 2022 might recur, but this time with the Ukrainians in a far weaker position. Well, if that's the case, the Pentagon may find that the Ukrainians are absolutely set against reversing the Kursk counteroffensive and are determined to dig in or try to dig in regardless of the cost. And the cost is turning out to be very high indeed. Now, yesterday was again one of the bloodiest days, according to the Russians, that the Ukrainians suffered on the Kursk battlefields. And if I can turn first to what Group of Forces North tells us about the situation on the battlefronts in Kursk, they give an account which again is fairly close to what the Russian Defense Ministry says. They say that fierce fighting continues at the Cherkasskoye Porechnoye settlement, where we repelled 2 Ukrainian attacks, totaling up to a company of personnel and 7 armoured vehicles. Enemy losses amounted to 40 troops, 3 armoured vehicles, and 3 armoured vehicles were destroyed. The enemy is increasing its efforts to capture the village of Malaya Lochnia. Now, this is a straightforward and unequivocal statement from Group of Forces North that Malaya Lochnia, which is actually located very close to Sudzha, north of Sudzha, is under Russian control. Most mappers, to my knowledge, continue to show Malaya Lochnia as being under Ukrainian control. Some days ago, Radovka reported that the Russians had recaptured it, and we see that Group of Forces North say that Malaya Lognia is indeed under Russian control and that the Ukrainians are making desperate efforts to recapture it. And Group of Forces North says that during the day, we repelled one attack with up to 30 troops. That's Ukrainian attack with up to 30 troops, 3 armoured vehicles and a tank. Then the enemy made another attack with large forces. Fighting is still going on. Now, since that report was written, which is early this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry has published its own report, which suggests that the attack on Malaya Lognia has been repelled. We'll come to that shortly. And then the Group of Forces North goes on to say, in the direction of Korenovo, the enemy unsuccessfully attacked Komarovka with up to 40 troops and 3 armoured vehicles, losing up to 10 men and 1 armoured vehicle. And then they say that over the past 24 hours, enemy losses amounted to more than 430 people. That's including the fighting in Kharkiv region, up to 350 of them in the Kursk and Sumy area. And then they say that they go on to say that we inflicted the greatest losses on the enemy in Ruskaya Konopelka. This is a village, as it turns out, perhaps more part of the Martinovka area. After a week of unsuccessful and huge losses, in a fit of desperation, the Ukrainians threw a company of mercenaries, foreign mercenaries there, but the result was the same: destroyed columns, burnt NATO equipment, and killed mercenaries from NATO countries. Victory will be ours, and they finish with a quote from a Roman writer, Cornelius Nepos: in war, nothing should be neglected. Somebody, as I said, has a classical turn of mind within Group of Forces North, or so it would seem. So that's their account. Now, the 350 troops that the Group of Forces North say that the Ukrainians have lost in the fighting in Kursk and in the bombing in nearby Sumy region is amongst the highest, but as we will see, the Russian Defense Ministry puts it higher still, almost certainly because the Russians, the fighting that Group of Forces North was telling us about, the fighting in this village of in this village of Cherkaskoye, in the village of Malaya Lognia, has now ended with the Ukrainians being repulsed, but experiencing very heavy losses. And anyway, this is what the Russian Defense Ministry says. Group of Forces North, supported by Army aviation and artillery, repelled attacks launched by enemy assault detachments towards Borki and Malaya Lognia. So there we go. They say that the attack was repelled and thwarted the enemy's attacks in the directions of Komarovka, Korenovo, Martinova, and Ruskaya Konopelka. Ukrainian losses have amounted to up to 70 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, and 1 motor vehicle. And then they say that that they continue to hunt enemy reconnaissance groups. 1 was captured and destroyed with a loss of up to 5 Ukrainian soldiers in a village called Kamishevka. And then they give a list of all the places where the Ukrainians have been bombed and shelled, both in Kursk region and in Sumy region. And they go on to say that in the past 24 hours, Ukrainian losses amounted to 400 troops, 50 more, the Group of Forces North said. almost certainly because as a result of the further fighting near Malaya Lochnia, and 17 armoured vehicles, including 1 tank, 2 armoured personnel carriers, 14 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 artillery guns, and 1 multiple launch rocket system. And they now put total Ukrainian losses at 5,137 troops killed and wounded, 69 tanks, 27 infantry fighting vehicles, 55 armoured personnel carriers, and 350 armoured fighting vehicles. One of the armoured vehicles that was destroyed in the fighting yesterday, and we have pictures of this, was a French Crotal point defence anti-aircraft system. It's a system a little bit like, well, it dates in the 1970s. It's a point defence system, a little like the Russian Tunguska and Panzer systems, only it only has missiles. It doesn't carry cannons. For some mysterious reason, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't itemize the destruction of these machines, these point defense systems, in its list of destroyed equipment of the Ukrainians, even though, as I said, we have photographic pictures of the destruction of this Crotal system. And it was destroyed apparently by a drone operated by Abdi Alaudinov's Akhmat Special Forces troops. So there we are. The Ukrainians have lost, alongside the 5 surface-to-air missile launchers that have been destroyed in this area, 3 Patriot systems and 2 Buk systems. They've also lost 1 very rare Tunguska point defense system, Soviet manufacture, and 1 equally rare Crotal system. Apparently there are only 10 of these in existence. There were only 10 of these in existence within the held by the French military. 2 of those have been supplied to Ukraine, and 1 of them has now been lost. So the losses, again, extremely high. Almost 70 tanks destroyed or disabled, according to the Russians, in this area. Large numbers of armoured vehicles destroyed. The losses of armoured vehicles, acknowledged in the West. Valuable assets like Patriot missiles destroyed, HIMARS systems destroyed, 3 of them. And according to the Russians, 5,137 troops killed and wounded. The cost, as General Bradley Geritsky of the US military says, ex-general, I should say, Bradley Geritsky of the US military says, is out of all proportion to the gains. And we see from NBC that this is clearly also the opinion of the Pentagon. They would like the Ukrainians to withdraw, to pull back. The nuclear power plant was not captured. Sending drones to damage it is extremely misguided, to put it mildly. It's unlikely many of those drones in the end will get through. And it is hardly in Ukraine's interests to try to create a nuclear accident. At least I would have thought not. So the Pentagon would rather the Ukrainians cut their losses whilst they still can and withdraw. And we have experts telling us that if the Ukrainians dig in and try to stay there, experts like Matthew Saville of the Royal United Services Institute, they're saying that the Russians will be able to inflict massive damage. They can get the Ukrainians into a position of further grinding attrition, and their logistics, which are very fragile in this area, will become a target. I think all of this is absolutely true. I think this is exactly correct, and I think this is exactly how this operation is going to pan out. The Ukrainians are sending more and more of their best men and their few available machines into what is in effect a black hole, a whirlpool, if you like, into which these men and machines just vanish. That perhaps is a callous way of putting it, given that we're talking about human lives. But I suppose war is a callous business, and this is a war of attrition, which is a particularly callous type of war. And the Ukrainians are assisting the Russians by inflicting attrition upon themselves. And as for Russian tactics, it seems to me that we now have a fairly clear idea of what they are. They're recreating the circumstances of Ukraine's summer 2023 Zaporozhye offensive, only in geography that is even more favourable to themselves. They're creating their great fortified lines to the north, around Kursk and Lvov and all of these other places, and Kurchatov. These provide a strong anchor for the Russian troops. They have created what is in effect a control zone south of these fortifications, which are, of course, as we speak, being built. They've created a control zone south of these fortifications in this area of hills and streams and forests and small settlements. And they're able to hunt and inflict terrible damage on the Ukrainians as the Ukrainians try to shuttle around this zone of control, risking constant attack and ambushing by Russian special forces and light infantry. And every so often, Russian tracked mechanized infantry enter the picture, as apparently they did in the fighting yesterday from Malaya Lochnia, which for some reason the Russians seem determined to hold on to, perhaps because it is close to Suja, and perhaps because it is also in a good location to provide further defences of the main road from Kursk to Suja, which the Russians clearly want to retain possession of. And elsewhere, well, we've been hearing lots about the Ukrainian advance south of the Sime River, but it doesn't seem to have happened, at least not so far. There were some reports of intense fighting between the Ukrainians and the Russian troops south of the Sime River, but I've seen no actual evidence that such fighting is, in fact, actually taking place. And may I here take an opportunity to rebut a common claim that I've read in many places now, which is that the Russian forces that are resisting the Ukrainians in Kursk are principally conscripts. It is undoubtedly the case that in the first day of the operation in Kursk, on the 6th of August, when the Ukrainians broke through towards Suja, they were able to capture a company of Russian infantry that was made up of young soldiers, 18-year-old soldiers, doing their one-year national service. And the Ukrainians also were able to capture some border guards, some Russian border guards, on that one day. But Since then, all of the Russian military units that I am aware of that have been fighting the Ukrainians in this area, in Kursk region, are not conscripts. They are actual contract soldiers, veteran soldiers from two Marine brigades who have been deployed to this particular area, from the Akhmat Special Forces. There's also a Special Forces unit, and as I've said previously, there are mechanized units now starting to appear, drawn from the Leningrad and Kaliningrad military districts. So, there we are. I get the sense overall that the Ukrainians are at a standstill in Kursk. They're suffering very heavy losses. The Russians are gradually building up their fortifications and probably building up their forces altogether in Kursk region. At some point over the next few weeks, perhaps in October, the Russians will go on to the offensive in this area. But in the meantime, the Ukrainians are bleeding themselves white. And they're doing so because they're trying to conduct an operation, continue with an operation, which, as the American reports show, now has no real objective at all. The Ukrainians, having failed to capture the Kursk nuclear power station, have no real reason to remain in Kursk. But for the various reasons that I've discussed in this program, they insist on remaining there. I suspect they will be resistant to any advice from the Americans to pull out, and that will ultimately play into the hands of the Russians. In fact, it is playing into the hands of the Russians as I speak. Now, very interestingly, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided today, as at the time of making this program, its account of the fighting in Kursk region, but it has not yet provided its daily report on the fighting in the area of in Donbass, in the area of the special military operation. Now, that is not because the news from the area of the special military operation is bad. It could be purely technical. Maybe the people who draw up this report are on leave, or somebody's ill, or there's been some technical problem that one should try to guess about. But I suspect the problem is that Russian advances are now taking place so fast that the Russian Defense Ministry is finding it difficult to keep up with the information. And they're not sure how much information at the present time it is right for them to disclose. So that, I think, is probably the problem. But anyway, for the record, as of the time that this video is made, we have no information from the Russian Defense Ministry, no daily update about what exactly is going on. But we do have ample information from other sources, and it paints a disastrous, indeed, I would go further, I'd say a catastrophic picture for the Ukrainians. Firstly, let us turn to the main area, the most important area, which is the area of Pokrovsk. I've discussed in many programs, going back several weeks now, before Ukraine began its Kursk operation, I've been saying that the single most important battlefront is the one towards Pokrovsk. There's been some reports about the size of the Russian forces in this area. I saw this in a Ukrainian report. It seems Group of Forces Center, which is perhaps the single most important grouping attacking towards Pokrovsk. Numbers around 78,000 men. Group of forces south, which is also involved in operations around Pokrovsk. As I understand it, numbers more than that, around over 100,000. I believe it is Group of Forces Centre that is the leading force pushing towards Pokrovsk, and the Group of Forces South, which is also involved in operations in the Konstantinovka, Vuhledar area, here is playing a supporting role. The commander of Group of Forces Centre, I believe, is President Mordvichev. General Mordvichev undoubtedly is the main commander of the forces pressing on towards Pokrovsk. And I think that he is probably, alongside General Templinsky, who commands Group of Forces Dnipro, the biggest single unit or group of forces in the area of the special military operation. Group of Forces Dnipro supposedly numbers up to 130,000 men. Anyway, alongside Teplinsky, Mordvichev has apparently emerged as Russia's most charismatic and capable and effective battlefield general, the one who's conducting the advance. And I spoke a couple of days ago about a telegram that the Russian defense minister, the new Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, had sent to the men of a motorized rifle brigade who had just captured Ivanivka, which appeared to me to be urging them on towards Pokrovsk. And yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry published news that Belousov has sent further similar messages to various other units also involved in the Pokrovsk operation, which praises each of them for what they have achieved, but which also I felt continues to urge them forward to advance further towards Pokrovsk. And, well, we're getting reports that the Russians are pushing hard in every direction in the Pokrovsk area. Firstly, there was a report this morning. This is not from the Defense Ministry, to be clear. Again, these are all from various bloggers and reporters. So everything must come with some question mark attached to it. But anyway, there was a report that the Russians now are regularly shelling and attacking with drones and keeping surveillance on the supply road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. This is the famous supply road about which we have been hearing so much. The reporter, the party that provided the report, which I read, by the way, on the Intel Slava Telegram channel, stressed that the Russians do not have complete fire control over this road. It is still possible for the Ukrainians to send supplies along it, but those supplies now travel along it at high risk, with the Russians very close to the road at various locations. It is possible for the Russians to attack vehicles that are moving along the road and to inflict serious damage. And again, I've heard some reports that the Russians are actually now thinking of beginning a general assault on Ukrainian positions along this road, intending to capture it altogether. And it could be that an attack on Vozvyzhenka is now pending, but there's some suggestions that the Russians are also thinking of advancing through the village of Yelizavetivka, which they have been bombing and shelling as well, and pressing forward towards the village of Novoekonomichnie, which lies directly on the road, just close. I think it's about a kilometer distant from Mirnograd itself. And there are reports now that an evacuation is indeed taking place from Mirnograd and Pokrovsk of the civilian population, but that it is very disorganized, with many people choosing to leave of their own accord without waiting for any evacuation coaches or buses provided by the Ukrainian authorities. And the last map that I saw concerning the fighting in the village of Grodivka, which is on the main road from Progress to Mirnograd, is that the Russians now do definitely control the greater part of this village, and it could be that this village, the battle for this village, will be completed fairly soon. But the big story here comes further south. Yesterday I mentioned that the Russians have captured the village of Ptyche. Almost certainly they've also captured a village called Komishevka. Yesterday the Russian Defense Ministry was saying that the Russians have captured another village called Mezhovye. All of these villages are bringing the Russians closer to the M04 highway that links Karlovka with Pokrovsk ultimately, and which passes close to the small town of Selidovo, which is one of the major logistical hubs of the Ukrainian forces. Now, the other place which is important is Novogrodovka. And yesterday I said that Redovka had published pictures which appeared to show that the Russians have bypassed or perhaps captured the coal mines and the slag heaps which lie to the east of Novogrodovka, and are now inside this large village or small town, fairly built up place, and that there is actually fighting now underway in Novogrodovka. But I did say that the pictures that Redovka had provided seemed to be very blurred and unclear, and I couldn't see any soldiers in them. Well, that's all been corrected today. We now have accurate film, obviously taken by Russian drones, which clearly show Russian troops deep inside Novogrodovka, clearing houses, buildings of Ukrainian defenders, and clearly a storming operation is underway. And my sense from these pictures is that Novogrodovka is very close to falling indeed. Perhaps it might even pass completely under Russian control within the next few hours. I think it is possible that one reason why the Russian Defense Ministry has delayed its update this morning is precisely because it is waiting for confirmation of what is happening in Novogrodovka. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. There are also reports that the Russians have also bypassed another coal mine and are approaching the village of Mikhailovka, which is on the E50 highway, which is the highway that the M04 highway turns into when it reaches Mikhailovka. Now, I should say that Mikhailovka, there were reports a couple of days ago that Mikhailovka had already been captured by the Russians, and I passed on those reports in earlier programs. It's now absolutely clear that those reports were wrong. They were premature. Maybe a Russian reconnaissance unit arrived or reached Mikhailovka and scouted the area. It might have briefly occupied the village, but it's clear that the Russians did not then and do not now have full control of this village. but it is likely that they will capture this village in a few days. They control the villages to the northeast, places like Mykolaievka, Novozelanye, Zavitne, and all of the indications are that they will soon be in a position to capture Mikhailovka as well. And of course, Mikhailovka is again literally outside Selidovo. If the Russians capture Mikhailovka, not only will they have cut the road to Pokrovsk, but they will be in a position where they can start storming Selidovo itself. And I don't know what sort of defenses the Ukrainians have in Selidovo and whether the Ukrainians would be able to resist the Russians for very long once the storming of operation of Selidovo begins. But the bad news in the Pokrovsk area doesn't just end with the news that the Russians are now launching drone and artillery strikes on Ukrainian supply convoys on the main supply road from Pokrovsk. And it's not ending with the news about Novogrodovka and Selidovo. We've also had news that the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Grodivka, the village on the main road from Progress to Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, the last big village before Mirnograd and Pokrovsk themselves are reached. Anyway, we got news that the situation of the Ukrainian troops there is also becoming extremely difficult. Not only has there been fighting within Grodivka itself underway for some time, with the Russians controlling perhaps half of this village, but yesterday we got reports that the Russians have captured the two villages of Kruty Yar and Krasny Yar, which are located to the southwest of Grodivka. And of course, if the Russians have captured Krasny Yar, the next village north of Krasny Yar is another village called Mykolaievka. If the Russians capture Mykolaievka, the Ukrainians in Grodivka risk encirclement because the Russians would then be in a position to attack the main supply road from Mirnograd to Grodivka, the 20511 road. And it's likely, given that the Ukrainians will be forced to pull back from Grodivka entirely. And of course, if that does happen, then Grodivka falls under Russian control, then the last big village, the last major center east of Mirnograd itself, of Pokrovsk in other words, will have passed under Russian control, and it's likely that a storming operation from Mirnograd, first from Mirnograd, and then Pokrovsk itself, will follow. My guess is that once the Russians have consolidated control of Grodivka, they'll probably want to capture two small villages to the north of the TO 511 road, Promin and Moskovsky. Those will be the last villages, but they're apparently very small places close to Mirnograd. I think they will also probably want to cut the main supply road. So at that point, we will probably see the attacks towards Vozvyzhenka and maybe Yelizavetivka and Novoekonomichny that I was talking about. And then a multi-vector attack by the full weight of the forces, a group of forces center, supported by a group of forces south on Mirnograd and Pokrovsk will take place. And the big question is, how strong are the Ukrainian defenses in this area? Well, an article that appeared in Associated Press suggested not strong at all. And in some ways, it's a rather sad article. Sad in that it shows Ukrainian commanders in the Pokrovsk area blaming their troops for their failures, which I really do think is very hard given the state of the conflict at this time. But the article reads, poorly trained recruits contribute to loss of Ukrainian territory on Eastern Front, commanders say. And we read that some new Ukrainian soldiers refused to fire at the enemy. Others, according to commanders, struggled to assemble weapons or to coordinate basic combat movements. A few have even walked away from their posts, abandoning the battlefield altogether. And we have a quote from a frustrated battalion commander of the 47th Brigade, apparently on its way to Kursk now. Some people don't want to shoot. They see the enemy in the firing position in trenches but don't open fire. That is why our men are dying. When they don't use the weapon, they are ineffective. And others spoke on the condition, others spoke about other things, all of them speaking in silence, speaking anonymously. They say that the recently conscripted Ukrainian troops are a far cry from the battle-hardened fighters who flocked to join the war in the first year. The new troops lack even a minimal level of training. Commanders and soldiers from 4 brigades defending the Pokrovsk area. So that tells us there's 4 Ukrainian brigades in this area, but they are apparently disorganized and made up, in many cases, of less high-quality troops. And they say they described having to plan operations with infantry who are unable to shoot targets and who are uninformed about basic topography. Some recruits simply lack faith in the battle plans of their superiors and walk away from prepared positions. Frustrated with the quality of the new conscripts sent to the front line by territorial recruitment centres, commanders are now seeking to conduct their own mobilisation drives to better screen and train new fighters. Multiple commanders and soldiers said, which would seem to be an incredible and bizarre diversion of resources at this time. And one would have thought that Ukraine needs all its best commanders and fighters at the front lines, not going to the rear and trying to drum up recruits. And one wonders why they think they will be more successful than the professional recruiters are. Anyway, one of them complained, he's from the 110th Brigade. The main problem is the survival instinct of the newcomers. Before, people could stand until the last moment to hold a position. Now, even when there is light shelling of firing positions, they are retreating. There are a few motivated troops, but nowhere near enough. And there are logistical hurdles to train, equip, and pay so many incoming people. And to ease that pressure, military leaders have had to take units from brigades in one region and transfer them to different areas to stabilise weak spots. And there's complaints about some of the commands, the commanders as well, and that some of the decisions that are made are slow and incompetent, and in some instances terrified new recruits have fled from the fight, which creates panic and chaos. And this is also the reason we have lost. And there's an example of this that's been given is the loss of the village of Progress. Supposedly, the units from the 31st Brigade broke and fled from Progress, forcing the 47th Brigade to enter the battle and attempt to stabilise the situation. You may recall that this was the area where there was supposed to have been an encirclement of Ukrainian troops by the Russians, and these troops heroically broke through the encirclement and retreated to Ivanivka. Well, this report suggests a rather different story, that in fact what actually happened was that the troops turned and fled, disobeying their orders to stand firm. And we're told that the new men did not have enough practice assembling and shooting rifles, and that the situation altogether is therefore very bad. Well, I think that is probably all true. And it also, by the way, brings into context the point that I just made at the start of this program, that the fact that the Ukrainians have apparently concentrated a third of their veteran battalions in the Sumy and Kursk area is more a testament to the weakness of the Ukrainian army, which is now having to rely increasingly on raw recruits, than to any idea that serious offensive operations are being prepared towards Kursk, Bryansk and Belgorod regions. Anyway, that's the situation around Pokrovsk. Yesterday, Redovka published an incredibly detailed analysis of the fighting in Toretsk. They said that the Russians are in control, definitely, of the two coal mines south of Toretsk, that the most likely approach that the Russians are going to take is to capture the area of the high-rise buildings in the northeast of Toretsk and to push from that area towards the center of Toretsk, fragmenting the Ukrainian defenders. And that, according to the latest reports, is exactly what has happened. The Russians are driving through. They've now captured fully the entire high-rise building area in the northeast of Toretsk, and they're pushing forward and pushing towards the center of Toretsk itself. My sense is that the Battle of Toretsk is probably close to its conclusion. There's been less news from Chasiv Yar today, though the last report I talked about yesterday speaks of Russian advances in Chasiv Yar. Our old friend Andrei Marochko says that the situation in Kupiansk continues to develop, as he would say, in the Russian favor. With regard to the situation near Peshanoye, this is one of the big villages near Kupiansk, if we talk about the enemy's behavior, Ukrainian armed formations are currently trying to slow down the advance of our forces. Naturally, enemy troops have been pulled back closer to reservoirs, directly to the Oskol rivers and the Oskol reservoir. They're now hastily trying to build new defense lines there. And further south in the area along the road from Vuhledar to Konstantinovka, we get more reports of further Russian advances. And there are pictures that Russian troops in Konstantinovka have now captured the banner of the 1st Battalion of the 79th, Ukrainian 79th Brigade that is trying to defend that village. And again, one senses that by now, a significant part of this village, Konstantinovka, perhaps the greater part of it, is under Russian control. Right, the group of forces north has provided its own account of the fighting in Volchansk. They say that they're continuing to advance in the high-rise building area of Volchansk. That seems to be a slow, grinding battle. But anyway, elsewhere in Donbass, the Russian advance is accelerating. Toretsk, as I said, looks close to falling. Selidovo will soon be attacked. And Pokrovsk, defended by just 4 battalions of the Ukrainian army, fewer than the forces, in other words, that the Ukrainians have in the Kursk and Sumy regions, looks dangerously exposed and likely to fall very quickly with the troops who are defending it apparently unable and unfit to do so. I think when the story of this war is finally written, it will become clear what a disastrous and ill-conceived operation the Kursk offensive was. I'm going to guess that the recriminations about it are going to be extremely strong, and I can imagine all kinds of finger pointing at its authors, both in Kiev and in Washington, London and Brussels. But anyway, there we are. I am going to just finish by saying that with all of this news piling in, with the situation, the general situation in Ukraine very bad, with the economy in a close, as far as I can tell, to collapse, with Germany, it seems, definitely cutting off financial aid, further financial aid to Ukraine, and with a report in the Financial Times that sorting out the problems of the loan, the 50 billion euro loan, dollar loan, which I discussed yesterday, that the problems are becoming very difficult to sort out, in part because of Hungarian opposition. I think that we might not be that far in military terms from the end game in Ukraine, that Alauddinov may turn out to be right, that it could be that the war will be over within 2 or 3 months. Perhaps disastrously for the Democrats before the November elections. It could be that the Western powers and the Ukrainians are going to try and pull some more tricks out of the bag, but I'm not sure what those would be. And with the acceleration of events that we are now seeing, I'm not clear how the Ukrainians resist for much longer. There was a video program published by the Times of India, serious newspaper, that spoke about the fact that the Ukrainian army now has 80,000 deserters. Modi has arrived in Kiev, but he's apparently made it very clear, according to Bloomberg, that he's heeding the Russian warnings and that India will not act as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. So the whole situation looks to me very, very dark for Ukraine. And I personally would not be surprised if at some point we came to see the events of this summer as preparing us for the end game. Anyway, there we are. That's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find more of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.